He was just a janitor. That's what everyone thought until career day changed everything. You see, while parents in designer suits were busy impressing teachers, they were busy humiliating the one man in that room who'd actually risked everything for their freedom. But his 12-year-old son, he knew the truth. And what happened next turned that entire school upside down. Stay with me, because this story will remind you why you should never judge someone by their uniform. The thing about Jefferson Middle School's career day is that it brings out the worst in people. I mean, you've got parents showing up in their sharpest suits, carrying briefcases they probably never use, all trying to one-up each other in front of a bunch of 7th graders who'd rather be anywhere else. The gymnasium that morning looked like someone had vomited motivational posters everywhere. Dream big. Your future starts here. Success is a choice. The kind of slogans that sound inspiring until you realize they're usually followed by someone telling you why your dreams aren't good enough. The air was thick with the smell of industrial floor cleaner mixed with that particular scent of nervous sweat that comes from parents trying too hard to impress people they'll never see again. Hank Doyle wasn't thinking about any of that as he pushed his mop bucket past the folding tables. 52 years old, gray creeping in at his temples like frost on autumn leaves, hands that told the story of 2 decades of honest work. Callous palms that had once gripped an M4 carbine now wrapped around a mop handle. The kind of man you'd walk past without a second glance. Weathered face, quiet demeanor, work boots that had seen better days but still carried him with a certain dignity that most people missed entirely. And that's exactly what most people did. They missed it. His uniform wasn't the crisp dress blues he'd once worn with pride, but navy work pants and a gray shirt with Jefferson Middle School maintenance embroidered on the chest. To most folks in that gym, that uniform made him invisible. Just part of the scenery, like the basketball hoops folded against the walls or the motivational banners hanging from the rafters. But his son, Jamie was watching everything. 12 years old, sitting in those uncomfortable metal chairs that squeaked every time you shifted, stomach twisted in knots because he knew what was coming. He'd lived through this before. The snickers when his dad walked by, the way teachers would lower their voices when they talked about career paths and making something of yourself, as if his father couldn't hear every word. Jamie's hands were clammy as he gripped the edges of his chair. He'd been dreading this day for weeks, ever since the bright yellow flyer came home announcing career day. While other kids were excited to hear from their parents, doctors, lawyers, engineers, business owners, Jamie just felt that familiar knot of embarrassment settling in his chest. See, Jamie had discovered something the night before, something that changed everything he thought he knew about his father. While digging through the attic for an old photo album his mom had asked him to find, he'd stumbled across a beat-up olive green folder shoved behind some Christmas decorations. The kind of folder that looks like it's been through hell and back corners bent, edges frayed, held together with what looked like military-grade determination. The metal clasp was tarnished, and there were water stains on the cover that spoke of journeys through places Jamie couldn't even imagine. And when he opened it, well, let's just say Jamie didn't sleep much that night. Inside that folder was a world he never knew existed. Photographs of his father, but not the father he knew. This was a younger man, lean and hard, wearing desert camouflage and carrying himself with the bearing of someone who'd seen things, done things, survived things. There were letters with official letterheads, citations with words like valor and heroism, and medals Jamie had never seen before. His father, the man who fixed leaky faucets and mopped floors, had once been Sergeant Henry Doyle, United States Army, and according to the papers in that folder, he'd been one hell of a soldier. The morning started exactly like you'd expect. The parents filed in wearing their success like armor-pressed suits, polished shoes, confident smiles, that said they belonged in rooms where important decisions were made. They carried leather portfolios and business cards, checking their phones. Between conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes, Dr. Martinez went first, talking about saving lives in the air. She had a slideshow full of medical equipment that made half the kids queasy, but she spoke with the authority of someone who held life and death in her hands every day. The applause was enthusiastic, genuine. Kids asked questions about blood and surgeries, their eyes wide with fascination. Mrs. Chan, the corporate lawyer, came next with her fancy business cards and talk about climbing the corporate ladder. She wore a suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month, and she spoke about contracts and negotiations like she was describing battles won and territories conquered. More applause, more questions about money and success. Officer Rodriguez showed up in full uniform, badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, talking about protecting and serving. His presence commanded respect, the kind of automatic deference people give to authority figures. He had stories about catching bad guys and keeping the community safe, and the kids hung on every word. Each presentation got the full treatment applause. Questions, teachers nodding approvingly like they were watching their own kids up there. The parents in the audience beamed with pride, some taking photos, others whispering to their neighbors about how impressive it all was. Then Principal Callahan did something that still makes my stomach turn. "Let's not forget," he announced, his voice echoing off the gym walls with that particular tone administrators use when they're about to say something they think is profound. "To thank the people who keep our school running every day." You could feel the energy in the room shift like air pressure dropping before a storm. Kids started looking around, confused. Parents checked their phones or suddenly found their coffee cups fascinating. The polite attention that had been focused on the front of the room began to scatter like leaves in the wind. "Mr. Doyle," Callahan called out, his voice carrying that false cheerfulness that adults use when they're trying to make something awkward. "Seem normal. Could you come up here for a moment?" The silence that followed was deafening. Not the respectful quiet that had greeted the other speakers, but the uncomfortable hush that falls when everyone suddenly realizes they're about to witness something embarrassing. Hank looked up from where he'd been quietly fixing a wobbly table leg in the back corner of the gym. You could see the surprise in his eyes, maybe a flash of something else. Embarrassment? Resignation? The look of a man who'd been put on the spot and knew there was no graceful way out. He wiped his hands on his work shirt, a gesture so automatic. It spoke of years of similar moments, and walked to the front of the room. His boots squeaked slightly on the polished floor, a sound that seemed to echo louder than it should have in the sudden quiet. Each step was measured, deliberate, the walk of a man who'd learned long ago to carry himself with dignity, even when the world was determined to strip it away. "Mr. Doyle is our head custodian," the principal announced, like he was introducing a circus act rather than a human being. "He's been with us for over 15 years. We appreciate all he does to keep our school clean and safe." The applause that followed was the kind you give when you feel obligated. Polite, brief, scattered. Few parents clapped like they were swatting flies, their attention already drifting back to their phones. It was the sound of people going through the motions, checking a box marked "Acknowledged to help." But then came the whispers. "See, honey? That's why you need to study hard. Imagine ending up like that. At least he has a job, I guess. Poor man. Wonder what went wrong in his life." The words drifted across the gymnasium like poison, each comment a small knife finding its mark. Jamie felt his face burn with shame and anger, a toxic mixture that made his hands shake. He watched his father hand back the microphone and return to his work, shoulders a little more hunched than before. And something inside Jamie's chest cracked like ice under pressure. And that's when things got ugly. During the break, While parents mingled and kids stretched their legs, a group of 8th graders started their little performance. They hunched. Their shoulders pretended to push invisible mops, shuffling around like they were imitating some kind of cartoon character. Their laughter was cruel, the kind that comes from kids who've learned that putting others down makes them feel bigger. "Look at me. I'm the janitor," one kid said in a fake gruff voice, dragging his feet and pretending to be old and tired. "Don't forget to study or you'll end up cleaning toilets for the rest of your life." The laughter spread like wildfire, feeding on itself until half the kids in the room were giggling at the show. Some of the parents noticed and smiled indulgently, as if watching their children mock a working man was somehow charming. Mrs. Cartwright, and I'm using her real name because what she did next was unforgivable, decided to join in with her own little joke. She was one of those teachers who thought she was clever, the kind who used sarcasm like a weapon and called it preparing kids for the real world. "Well, class," she said, loud enough for half the gym to hear, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that makes you want to punch walls. "I hope you're all paying attention to these career presentations, because there are many different paths in life, and, well, some paths require more education than others." She glanced meaningfully toward where Hank was quietly stacking chairs, her implication hanging in the air like smoke from a house fire. Jamie's hands clenched into fists under the table. The folder in his backpack felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, its contents burning against his consciousness like a secret too big to contain. He wanted to scream, to stand up and tell everyone exactly what they were looking at, but his throat felt closed, his voice trapped somewhere between rage and heartbreak. But the worst was yet to come. After lunch, they opened the floor for questions. Kids were asking about college requirements, salary expectations, the usual stuff that 12-year-olds think they need to know about adult life. The atmosphere had settled back into that polite educational drone, parents and teachers nodding, along as if wisdom was being dispensed. Then Sarah Mitchell, the kind of kid who thinks she's clever, who's learned that getting laughs makes you popular, raised her hand with a smile that should have been a warning to everyone in the room. "What if someone doesn't want to go to college?" she asked, her voice dripping with fake innocence that fooled exactly no one. "Like, what if they just want to be a janitor?" The room erupted. Kids were laughing, parents were smirking behind their hands, and even some teachers were struggling to hide their grins. It was the kind of moment that reveals who people really are when they think no one important is watching. Principal Callahan tried to regain control, his voice rising above the laughter. "Every job has value, Sarah. Every job is important to our community. But the damage was done." The laughter kept rolling like thunder, and Jamie could see his father in the back of the room, methodically sweeping the same spot over and over, his face carefully blank in the way that only comes from years of practice at being invisible. That's when Mr. Peterson, some hotshot real estate developer who wore his wealth like a badge of honor, decided to make his grand gesture. He accidentally knocked over his coffee cup near the stage. The dark liquid spread across the floor like spilled blood, seeping into every crack and crevice of the polished wood. Steam rose from the hot coffee, and the smell of burnt beans filled the air. "Oh, janitor," he called out, waving Hank over like he was summoning a servant rather than addressing a human being. "Could you clean this up, please? We've got a bit of a mess here." His tone was casual, dismissive, the way you might ask someone to pick up a piece of trash. There was no apology for the spill, no acknowledgement that he just created work for someone else. Just the expectation that the help would come running when called. Every eye in that gymnasium turned to watch Hank Doyle walk to the front of the room. His boots squeaked with each step, a sound that seemed to echo off the walls like a countdown. He knelt down, pulled out his mop, and began cleaning up the spill while 50 parents and 200 kids watched in silence. Peterson stood over him, arms crossed, that smug smile plastered across his face like he'd just won some kind of contest. The power dynamic was clear: the successful businessman and the lowly janitor, the winner and the loser, the important person and the invisible one. That's when Jamie couldn't take it anymore. He stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a caged bird, and his hands were shaking as he reached for that olive green folder. The weight of it in his hands felt like justice waiting to be served. "Jamie?" Mrs. Cartwright's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Is there something you'd like to share?" Jamie's voice came out as barely a whisper at first, the words catching in his throat like they were afraid to come out. "Yeah, I do." He cleared his throat, found his strength somewhere deep in his chest where his father's blood ran through his veins. "I want to talk about my dad." The room went dead quiet. Even Peterson stopped smirking, his attention caught by something in Jamie's voice, a steel that hadn't been there before, a determination that commanded attention. Jamie opened the folder with trembling fingers and pulled out a photograph. It was faded, the edges worn from handling, but you could still make out the image clearly: a much younger Hank Doyle in army fatigues, standing in a desert landscape with his squad. The men around him looked hard, weathered, the kind of soldiers who'd seen combat and lived to tell about it. "This is my dad," Jamie said, holding up the photo for everyone to see, his voice growing stronger with each word. But he wasn't always the janitor here. The silence in the room was complete now, the kind of quiet that comes when everyone suddenly realizes they're about to learn something important. He used to be Sergeant Henry Doyle, United States Army. He served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the 173rd Airborne Brigade. He got the Bronze Star for saving his squad when their convoy was ambushed outside Kandahar. You could have heard a pin drop. Parents who'd been checking their phones suddenly looked up. Kids who'd been fidgeting in their seats went still. Even the teachers stopped their quiet conversations and turned to listen. Jamie pulled out the citation, his hands steadier now, his voice carrying across the gymnasium like a bell. "For heroic service in connection with military operations against a hostile force, Sergeant Doyle's actions saved the lives of 6 fellow soldiers under direct enemy fire, disregarding his own safety to ensure the survival of his unit." He looked up at the crowd, his eyes blazing with a fire that came from somewhere deeper than anger, somewhere closer to truth. He was wounded pulling his friends out of a burning Humvee, but he went back 3 times to make sure everyone got out alive. He's got medals and letters from commanders who call him one of the finest soldiers they ever served with. He never talks about it because he doesn't think he needs to prove anything to anybody. Jamie's voice cracked, but he pushed through, the words pouring out like water through a broken dam. "He's not just a janitor. He's a hero. He served his country, saved lives, and sacrificed more than any of you will ever know. And he's my dad." For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The weight of Jamie's words hung in the air like smoke, settling over the crowd with the gravity of revealed truth. Then, from the back of the room, a voice spoke up. "Coringal Valley, 2009? It was Mr. Thompson, the 8th grade history teacher. He was standing now, staring at the photograph with wide eyes that held recognition. Thompson was a thin man with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of teacher who actually cared about the subjects he taught. "I was there," Thompson said, his voice carrying across the silent gym with the weight of shared experience. "Different unit, but I remember hearing about a Sergeant Doyle. You pulled 2 guys out of a burning Humvee, didn't you? Rodriguez and Martinez." Hank looked up from where he was still kneeling with the mop, coffee stains on his knees, his face showing surprise at being recognized. He nodded once, almost reluctantly, the gesture of a man who'd never sought credit for doing what he saw as his duty. Thompson crossed the gym in long strides, his footsteps echoing in the silence. When he reached Hank, he stopped and offered a crisp military salute, his back straight, his face serious with the respect that one veteran shows another. "Welcome home, Sergeant." That's when everything changed. One by one, other people began to stand. A parent who'd served in Iraq rose from his seat, his face solemn with recognition. The school security guard, a Vietnam veteran with gray hair and knowing eyes, pushed himself up from his chair. Even some of the kids, sensing the gravity of the moment without fully understanding it, rose to their feet. The silence was profound, respectful, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any applause, deeper than any cheer. It was the silence of recognition, of honor acknowledged, of truth finally revealed. Hank stood slowly, setting his mop aside with the careful movements of a man who'd learned to maintain his dignity in any circumstance. He didn't say anything he didn't need to. He just nodded, accepting the recognition he'd never asked for, the respect he'd never demanded. Peterson, the guy who'd spilled the coffee, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. His smug smile had vanished, replaced by the uncomfortable expression of a man who just realized he'd made a fool of himself in front of everyone who mattered. Mrs. Cartwright cleared her throat, her face flushed red with embarrassment. "Thank you, Jamie. And thank you, Mr. Doyle, for your service." Principal Callahan stepped forward, and for once, he seemed to understand the weight of the moment. His usual administrative bluster was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine humility. "I think we all owe Mr. Doyle an apology," he said quietly, his words carrying to every corner of the gymnasium. "And our gratitude. We talk about respect and service in this school, but sometimes we forget what those words really mean." The rest of career day passed in a blur. Students lined up to shake Hank's hand, their young faces serious with newfound respect. Parents who'd been whispering jokes an hour earlier now offered quiet thanks and embarrassed apologies. Mr. Thompson stayed after, talking with Hank about their shared experiences, swapping stories that only veterans could truly understand. Jamie stood beside his father, the folder still clutched in his hands like a shield. For the first time in his life, he felt like he could breathe freely in that school. The weight of shame he'd carried for so long had lifted, replaced by something stronger: pride. But here's the thing about Hank. Doyle, the recognition didn't change him. When the assembly ended and the last parent had filed out, he went back to work. He finished stacking the chairs, swept the gym floor, and made sure everything was ready for classes the next day. When Jamie offered to help, Hank smiled and handed him a broom. "Teamwork," he said simply, the word carrying more meaning than a dozen speeches about duty and service. They worked together in comfortable silence, father and son, while the late afternoon sun slanted through the high windows of the gymnasium. The building was quiet now, empty except for the two of them and the echoes of the day's revelations. The walk home was different that day. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and Jamie found himself walking a little taller. The familiar streets looked the same, but something fundamental had shifted. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding that hadn't been there before. At home, Jamie placed the folder on the kitchen table like it was a family treasure, which, he realized, it was. He looked at his father, searching for the right words to express everything he was feeling. "I'm proud of you, Dad," he said quietly, the words carrying more weight than any medal or citation. Hank smiled, and for a moment, Jamie saw past the gray hair and the work-worn hands to the young soldier in the photograph. "I'm proud of you, too, Jamie, for standing up for what's right." That took courage. They sat together as the sun set, the folder open between them like a bridge across years of silence. For the first time, Hank began to share stories he'd kept locked away for years, about the friends he'd made and lost in the mountains of Afghanistan, about the moments that still visited him in quiet hours when sleep wouldn't come, about why he'd chosen a simple life after serving his country in ways most people would never understand. Rodriguez was from Texas, Hank said, his voice soft with memory. Had a wife and 2 little girls. Martinez was barely 19, wanted to be a teacher when he got out. When that IED went off and their Humvee caught fire, he paused, his eyes distant with remembering. I didn't think about being a hero. I just thought about getting my boys home. That's what you do. You take care of your people. Jamie listened, understanding more than he could put into words. He was learning that heroism wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about doing what needed to be done, even when no one was watching. People think being a janitor is beneath them, Hank said eventually, his voice carrying the wisdom of a man who'd seen both the worst and best of humanity. But there's dignity in honest work. There's honor in serving others, whether it's in a war zone or a middle school. The uniform doesn't make the man makes the uniform. Jamie nodded, the truth of those words settling into his bones. Like marrow, he thought about all the times he'd been embarrassed by his father's job, all the moments he'd wished for a different life. Now he understood that he'd been looking at everything backwards. The next morning at school, things were different. Not dramatically. Hank wasn't suddenly wearing his medals to work or giving speeches about his service. He was still the same quiet, hard-working man he'd always been, still arriving early and staying late, still taking pride in keeping the school clean and safe. But now people saw him. Students who'd walked past him for years now nodded respectfully in the hallways. Teachers included him in conversations, asked his opinion on things that mattered. The principal asked him to speak at the next assembly, not about his military service, but about the importance of dignity and hard work. Hank agreed, but kept his speech short. He talked about doing your best, about treating everyone with respect, regardless of their job or background. He never mentioned the Bronze Star or the battles he'd fought. He didn't need to. His presence said everything. Jamie watched from the back of the auditorium, his heart full. He knew his father would never seek the spotlight, never demand recognition for his service. But he also knew that real heroism didn't need applause. It just needed to be seen. Weeks passed, and the story of Sergeant Doyle spread quietly through the school. Not as gossip or sensation, but as a reminder. A reminder that heroes walk among us every day, often invisible, always humble. Teachers began using his story as an example when they talked about respect and service. Students started looking at all the school staff differently, understanding that everyone had a story worth knowing. And sometimes, it takes a 12-year-old boy with a beat-up folder to help us see them. The folder still sits on Jamie's desk at home. Sometimes, when homework gets overwhelming or kids at school get mean, he opens it and remembers what real strength looks like. It looks like his dad, mopping floors and fixing broken things, carrying the weight of his service with quiet dignity. It looks like a man who served his country in war and continues to serve his community in peace. It looks like a hero who never needed anyone to call him one. Mrs. Cartwright never made another joke about janitors. Mr. Peterson, the real estate developer, made a point of apologizing personally to Hank and made a substantial donation to the school's Veterans Memorial Fund. The 8th graders who'd mocked the janitor found themselves assigned to help with school maintenance as part of a new community service requirement. But the biggest change was in Jamie himself. He walked taller now, spoke up more in class, and never again felt ashamed of his father's work. He'd learned that dignity isn't about what job you have, it's about how you do that job. And his father did his job with the same honor and dedication he'd brought to serving his country. Before you go, I want you to think about the quiet heroes in your own life. The people who serve without recognition, who work without praise, who carry their own stories of sacrifice and service. Maybe it's the person who cleans your office building, or the security guard who watches over your neighborhood, or the maintenance worker who keeps your world running smoothly. Leave a comment below and tell me about them. Let's fill this space with stories of dignity and honor, because every veteran's legacy matters, and every act of service deserves to be seen. Because sometimes the most powerful uniform is the one nobody notices until someone finally does. And when that moment comes, when the truth is finally revealed, it changes everything. Not just for the hero who's been hiding in plain sight, but for everyone who witnesses the revelation. It reminds us that heroism isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's quiet, humble, and dressed in work clothes. Sometimes it's your neighbor, your coworker, or the person you pass in the hallway every day without really seeing. Sometimes it's the janitor. And sometimes all it takes is one person, one son, one student, one voice of truth to change how the whole world sees them. That's the power of recognition. That's the gift of seeing people for who they really are, not just what they appear to be. That's why this story matters. And that's why every story like it matters too.